There was a murder in my apartment building. The deceased was a middle-aged man who lived in the penthouse. The killer had cut his mouth from ear to ear with a knife and nailed the corners of his mouth up to his temples. The man was found dead with his eyes rolled back and a grotesque grin on his face. The residents of the apartment lived in fear, and the investigation was slow as the murderer scene yielded no evidence of the killer. 3 days after the incident, the same video was sent simultaneously to the cell phones of all the residents of the apartment building from a mysterious number. The video showed a clown looking at the screen and giggling in an unnerving manner, saying, "Smile, smile, smile." He then picked up the camera and showed us his surroundings, the penthouse of the man who died a few days earlier. The man was tied to a chair, crying out for help, and the clown pulled out a sharp knife and began to slice the man's mouth open. After slicing the screaming, struggling man's mouth from ear to ear, the clown held the corner of the man's mouth up, smiled for the camera, and then took out a hammer and began hammering nails into the corner of the mouth. The clown giggled as he spun around in the swiveled chair to which the man was strapped with his mouth torn open and a wide grin on his face. Then the screen suddenly went black, and the words, "James, room 503 next," appeared in white letters on a dark background. My heart sank and I sat back in my seat. The fact that the clown knew my name and my home address gave me goosebumps. How did he know me, and why was I his next target? I hadn't done anything to earn someone's grudge. While I sat there in a panic, other residents who had seen the video called the police and officers came to my house. They asked me if I knew who the clown was, and I suddenly realized that the man next door in room 504 might be the culprit. I had been losing sleep over the past few nights due to a thumping noise coming from my neighbor. One night I went to bed before an important meeting the next day, and again I heard a thumping noise from my neighbors. So I went over to their house after midnight and rang the doorbell. "Who is it?" The suspicious-looking man next door opened the front door with a hanger, and through the narrow doorway I could see he was holding a hammer. I don't know what he was doing in the middle of the night, but that hammer seemed to be the source of the noise. "It's your neighbor. You're being too loud and I need to get some sleep," I said in an irritated tone to the man, who glared at me for a moment before slamming the front door. I told the police that I heard the man next door hammering every night and had seen him with a hammer myself, so I suspected he was the culprit. The police listened to my story and they said they would take a closer look at the man next door. When the police returned, I couldn't bear to stay in the apartment, so I took an extended leave of absence from work, packed up my things, and went down to the countryside to live with my parents. I stayed at my parents' house for about a month, and there were no more murders in the apartment because the police were keeping an eye on the man next door. With this lull, I returned to the apartment on my last day of vacation. I walked into the lobby of my apartment building and was greeted by the doorman with a big smile on his face. "You're back home. I'm so glad you're safe." "Yes, it's been a while." After a long drive, I was too tired to answer the man's friendly greeting, so I gave a rough answer and I waited for the elevator. He told me that he saw the man next door lurking in front of my door a few days ago, and that he's going to take me there because he thinks it might be dangerous. When we got to the 5th floor and the elevator doors opened, I saw my neighbor standing in front of my front door, smoking a cigarette. The man's eyes looked murderous, and I was terrified. So I asked the doorman to go inside the house with me. He and I walked past the neighbor in a tense moment, and suddenly the neighbor lunged at me from behind, grabbed me from the back of the head, and started dragging me into his house. "Help me!" I shouted, frightened. The doorman quickly picked up my suitcase and slammed it down on the man's head as hard as he could, and the man collapsed, bleeding on the spot. "What do we do now? I think he's dead," I asked him, breathing heavily. He looked surprised and broke out in a cold sweat. "I didn't think he would die. Isn't this considered self-defense? Let's get him inside the house before anyone sees him and think about it." He and I picked up the fallen man and hurried him inside the house.
"I don't think anyone else has seen him yet,"
he said, looking out the front door. Just then, the man next door, whom I thought was dead, struggled to raise his head and shouted,
"Run!"
Suddenly, the doorman pulled out a knife from his pocket and slashed the man's mouth wide with a single blow, and the man screamed and died with one side of his mouth torn off. When I saw the scene, I was so stunned that my whole body went rigid. The doorman said,
"Whew, that could have been really bad."
He breathed a sigh of relief and took off his jumper, revealing a colorful clown costume hidden inside. He smiled up at me, put on the clown mask, and said,
"Hello, James, from room 503. You didn't smile when I smiled and greeted you in the lobby every day. The people who live here are so unkind. Anyone who doesn't respond back to my smile will keep smiling even after they die."